You mentioned the Thucydides trap at this point in your book, and you mentioned that you think applying this to China and the U.S. is an overly simplistic view, is how I'd paraphrase what you said. Why do you think that's so?
Well, first of all, the case studies on which the Thucydides trap theory had been built by Professor Graham Allison, is mostly Western case studies.
Sure.
Not, I think if you look at it carefully, overwhelmingly, could be 14 phase out of 16. Actually, exact number escapes me at the moment, but I have written about it elsewhere. So most of the case studies come from the West. Now, in the Eastern Asian context, we didn't have a Thucydides trap. It was more of a hierarchical system based on trade, reciprocity, and kind of acknowledging the symbolic centrality of China in many ways, even though not really accepting Chinese sovereignty. So it's very Eurocentric in that way. Second, and Western-centric. Secondly, look at the scale. We're talking about Athens and Sparta.
Yeah.
Very tiny little, polities. We're talking about U.S. and China. They're, the largest, two of the largest countries in the world, most powerful countries in the world. So even though human nature can replicate itself across time and space, but you cannot say that the same dynamic will prevail. So you cannot extrapolate something that small, that past of deep in history to something that big, that contemporary. But I also think that the world has changed since the before Christ era, the ancient period. Today we have a lot more constraints on war. We have nuclear weapons. Where were nuclear weapons to prevent war between Athens and Sparta? We still have a lot of economic interdependence. Still have U.S. depending on China, China depending on the U.S. And we still have institutions, diplomacy. So I think it's simplistic. There is a tendency up to a rising power and a status quo power to go into conflict with each other, but it hasn't happened all the time. It didn't happen between Britain and the U.S. It was a generally peaceful transition. So I don't think we should develop laws of history based on I don't do that. I love ancient period history, but I would have to qualify that. So you can say that there is a tendency for two big powers to be rivals. Okay, Persia and Greece.
Sure.
But you say that this is something a law, something a trap, something inevitable. That's where I think is exaggerated.
Sure. Well, and that kind of brings to my next question, because you mentioned Heraclitus and his view of the world, which, reading your book, I'm assuming you put him in there because, you agree with a lot of his worldview, which was that the world is a world of flux, versus others view this as stasis. So to your point, the idea of like this Thucydides trap, there's two powers, there's this, former American global Western hegemony, and that's the stasis. And really what you're arguing is, no, there's flux, and here's where flux could take us. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's very fair. So I think the world is being in a flux is more accurate for most of history than the idea of the world being static. So in that sense, I think that's one of the ideas from Greece that we should keep in mind and develop. It has been developed. But I think it's good that you mentioned Heraclitus, because he's one of the examples of a Greek who actually went back to Athens after the Persian occupation of Miletus and the Anatolian Greek settlements. Mm-hmm. And was decided he was expelled. But also he grew up. He was born and he grew up during Persian rule. Then he went to Athens, and he was not well received there. So the moral of the story is there is a myth in Western narrative, and a lot of classical scholars have propounded this, that when the Greeks not won the war against Persia, had the Persians had taken over Athens and the entire Greek peninsula, Greek cultural area, there would be no flowering of philosophy.
Sure.
But here is an example. Under Persian rule, the philosophy in Miletus flourished, and people like Heraclitus could actually do what they wanted to do.
Sure.
So what I'm trying to say is a very interesting example of how we have overplayed the Greeks and underplayed or denounced the Persians. But the general idea of a flux here is much closer to my line of thinking than the status.
Well, and you pointed out that, you mentioned Alexander the Great earlier, which you write about in your book. He was very influenced by Aristotle. Aristotle thought democracy was a mob, or was mob rule, and instead preferred a monarchy as a superior form of government. Again, looking back at the arc of history, even, to your point, in the, common era, or, in the year of our Lord, as they say, I guess, isn't a form of monarchy a more common ruling authority versus our machinations of what a democracy is, whether that be a true democracy in the Swiss sense, like you talk about in your book, or in the democratic republic sense, or the parliamentarian sense of, say, in India? Isn't that actually a much less practiced form of authority in government, and therefore might not actually be the long-run arc of history?
Yeah, that's a very important, maybe contentious point, because we all have internalized the idea that democracy is the best form of government. And I happen to think that democracy is actually the best form of government that one could have. The problem is, could one have genuine democracy? And you are quite right that Aristotle was a pupil of Alexander. Alexander was a pupil of Aristotle. So Aristotle was the teacher. His father, Philip, hired Aristotle to tutor him. Alexander always carried books of Aristotle under his, in fact, some people say under his pillow, and stayed very reverential to the end. But when Alexander himself conquered Egypt and Persia, he did not create democracies or even polities or republics. He actually made himself, anointed himself as the pharaoh of Egypt and the great king of Persia. So he adopted the Eastern tradition of divine monarchy because that fitted his ego, his temperament, and he became the greatest pupil, the so-called greatest Western pupil of the East. He transmitted the idea of divine monarchy from the East to the West, and later on, many Western rulers in Europe adopted identified with the divine monarchy institution.
Sure.
But why did Alexander, in that sense, what does this tell us about democracy versus divine monarchy? If we just forget about our ideological preferences, okay? You and I might like democracy, but throughout history, divine monarchy and empire sanctioned by a divine authority has been far more prevalent, far more common than democracy. The Athenian democracy was limited. It only gave right to vote to very small number of people living there. So you have to do military service.
Sure.
You have to be male. And there's less than 20% of people who could actually vote. And Athenian democracy did not have individual liberty. It was the liberty of the state. Don't be dominated by an empire or each other, but individual liberty, right to speak out against the authority of the polis. You could be ostracized or asked to drink poison, like happened to Socrates.
Sure.
So and Athenian democracy was not very exportable. It didn't really go anywhere. I mean, Alexander himself did not export it.
Sure.
So, however, later on, it became, and especially with the French Revolution, and then with the United States and the rise of the West, even the rise of the West, for the most part, was not we didn't have democracies. We had limited democracies that evolved. It's only in the 19th century and 20th century that we had a democracy with universal franchise and civil liberties. Now, in that sense, the history tells us that divine monarchy had been much more common and, in that sense, much more durable. Now, does it mean that we should all go for divine monarchy today? I'm not saying that, but keep that in mind. Why democracies are fragile today?
Sure.
Because they have been inherently fragile, inherently unworkable. There's always a tendency, and mostly from within rather than from outside, forces to subvert democracy. It could
Sure.
have a strong leader who could do that. It could be populism. It could be sectarianism. It could be simply inability to produce public goods for the people, like economic
Sure.
growth or security. So if we understand the fragility of democracies, you will be better able to defend it rather than axiomatically say this is good. There's nothing else is comparable. So democracy at every cost. Understand the fragility and understand there are different variations within democracies. The American democracy is not the same as the, say, Western British democracy, very, very different, or European democracy and the like.
Well, and you point out that, like, Alexander, just as an example, he adopted the Persian administration system of the satraps, for example. I think a lot, one of the fragilities of Western democracy in my mind is many of these democracies started with what I'll call cultural hegemony, right? There was kind of a monoculture to them, simplistically speaking, even though there's obviously everyone has their opinion. But again, there's certain cultural, call it averages or means that they carried. And as they become older democracies, their cultural, likeness is dispersed. And to your point, if there's a monarchy, it's easier to deal with that because there's a monarchy. But in a democracy, it means it pivots and it's a lot more in flux. Is that a fair way of assessing the fragility?
Yeah, I think, there are different types of monarchies. And by the way, I should point out that the Greeks, including Plato and Aristotle, did praise the Persian monarchy. They said Persian monarchy was actually one of the ideal monarchies, especially Cyrus the Great, which allowed actually more tolerance than the Greek democracy did. So I think democracies and monarchies are different in that sense. And I without elaborating, I agree with what you said. I mean, in a monarchy, you have, if the monarch is virtuous, that's a big thing, though. Because monarchy can, as Aristotle said, it can turn into tyranny. But if a lot of things in a monarchy depends on personal virtue. Personal virtue in the West, in ancient Greece, in ancient India, and especially ancient China. The personal virtue of the ruler, a benign ruler, morally virtuous, but also avoiding harsh tactics, like too much harsh punishment of the people. And that depends on convention, and that also depends on norms of the society.
Sure.
So Confucianism is not a religion per se, but it has some norms about benign authority.
Sure.
India had norms about benign authority. The West had norms about benign authority. As long as a monarch is, by the way, bound by these norms and doesn't turn it into a personal fiefdom, disregarding advisors or the checks and balances that were introduced, say, in the Roman Republic, for example. If you will have a wise, benign ruler with some checks and balances, I think a monarchy could work well.